Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up of some of my recent reading. Instead of doing the usual least to most depressing, I'm going to go most to least disappointing, maybe. So first up, I Don't Want to Die Poor by Michael Arceneaux. This is listed as a collection of essays, but it feels more like a memoir that's essentially a sequel to his earlier book, I Can't Date Jesus. That I thought was a lot more successful, just in the sense that because it was more of a coming-of-age story and more of a kind of coming to terms with different cultural elements. Both, he was originally from Houston and went to university in DC and then lived in New York City for a while, and so in that book he's reckoning with the cultural differences and also coming to terms with his family is from a Louisiana Creole background and are Catholic, and he's coming to terms with how does that interact with queerness and so on and so forth. So I went into this not really knowing what it would be about, but since it says essays, I assumed it was going to be a collection of his writing from other places. Now, what I had missed, and the reason that most people who picked up this book picked it up, is because it was marketed as being essays on the relationship of kind of mid-generational millennials to the financial state of their lives in terms of home ownership versus renting, in terms of relationships and where people are located, with student debt hanging over them. Because he had gone to a private university, so his student debt was high, and as a writer, he wasn't in a high income rate, and so on and so forth. Going into this, not knowing that that was supposed to be the theme of the book, I thought this was fine. Not great, not terrible, just sort of catching up with somebody whose coming-of-age memoir I'd read, so it was kind of interesting catching up with him, but nothing outstanding. However, I think if I had seen the marketing and expected this to be primarily about finance and the relationship of personal finance to culture and to your status in life and all of that, I think I would have been disappointed. And looking at the reviews, a lot of people who bought this book based on the marketing that that's what it was about were disappointed, because there are one or two essays that are specifically looking at his issues with debt collectors and the way he chose to go to this private university in DC rather than going to a state university in Texas, and which would have been cheaper. While interesting, is not in any way the central part of the book. So sometimes he'll be telling a story that's about relationships and he'll mention that somebody calls to collect on a debt, or he'll be talking about grocery shopping and he'll talk about costs, but it's really not the focus. So this is definitely a book that was mismarketed, and having come at it not knowing that that's how it was marketed, I thought this was acceptable. But I think if you saw the marketing and are thinking, oh, maybe I should pick that up because I got this in the $2 bin at Book Outlet, if you saw the advertising, don't buy it for that. It's a memoir. If you read the first one, it might be fun to catch up with him. Otherwise, it's not particularly outstanding. It's just fine. Next up, I read a book that is not exactly a memoir, but was originally conceived as one. And this is a graphic novel written by Jenny White and drawn by Ergün Gündüz, who writes and draws the Taksi comic that I talk about sometimes. Jenny White is originally from the US, but she went to university in Turkey in the 70s. She currently lives in Sweden, where she's a professor of Turkish studies. And this is detailing the impact of the political issues, putting it mildly, in the years running up to the 1980 coup, as they played out among university students in Turkey in the 70s. And that's a great topic for a book, but this book is frankly not well done. Now, the art in this I thought was quite interesting, and I like Gündüz's art in general, but it's just not well scripted. Just to give an example, the last 4 pages of this are portraits of the children of the main characters and then blurbs about their life. So we don't meet the children of these main characters. We just get a blurb. It's very odd. It feels almost like somebody who's missed a school reunion, and so they send a blurb about themselves. But there's no reason to read that in a book that's fiction that's supposed to be loosely based on people that the author knew when she was at university in the 70s. It is so strange. I think maybe this has some value if you're exclusively interested in the art, because I think the use of switching between black and white and then color with a kind of watercolor look is a really interesting artistic choice. So on that basis, it's maybe worth picking up, but it's just not well written. It's such a mess. There is no real depth. We follow 4 characters, 2 of whom are more right-wing and 2 of whom are more left-wing. And we just never get to know them particularly. The 2 left-wing characters end up married at the end, and again, it's like they happen to be at places where things that are representative of political protests and crackdowns and whatnot that happened in the 70s. So I suppose if you didn't know that any of this happened, it's maybe a little enlightening that way, but it's just not well done. And such a wasted opportunity. And I think the basis of something interesting is there, but genuinely a lot of the book felt like it was the outline. And in the introduction, the author actually comments that the artist told her at one point that he couldn't draw some of the things that she was writing, and so she tried to make it more of a script, and I just don't think she ever really succeeded. It's just not very well done as a story. It feels like an outline, and this should have been 3 times as long, and just, really disappointing, because you just don't see things like that are available to an Anglophone audience, and yeah, so it just felt like a wasted opportunity, which is a shame. Alright, next up we're going to continue with comics for a couple of books here. And I just finished Sabba Khan's What is Home, Mum? This is a graphic memoir which details the author's relationship with, in part her relationship with her parents, but primarily her relationship with herself in relationship to both her parents and their home culture and to the culture of London and to England and the UK in general. And also her kind of grappling with belief and disbelief and figuring out where she wants to stand religiously. This is a book where I've seen some criticism from some quarters who want this to be symbolic in a way that I don't think it should be. This is the author's personal experience, so this is the author dealing with the complicated reality of growing up and realizing at various points how much you don't know about what you don't know. Because she talks, for example, about she lived in a particularly South Asian neighborhood, and her parents were Kashmiri, but her dad had moved to England when he was 17. So his perspective on what their home culture is very limited, and it is not until she's older that she realizes that essentially the culture that he's encouraging his children to maintain in England doesn't even exist in Kashmir, right? Because it's something that he was so young when he left that it ended up becoming a kind of idealized thing in his mind and beyond. And that's one minor part. This is actually far more about her relationship with her mother than her relationship with her father. But I think that bit is kind of representative of the kind of thing that she's trying to deal with as she goes through this. It kind of drops off at the end where she gets into her relationship with her husband, partner, I don't know. And I really liked the art style in this, which plays quite a lot with both use of color in only certain places and also kind of overlaps some of the illustrations, which is all really interesting. So I thought this was exceptionally well done. This is the author talking about her personal experience and to symbolically turn her into something to either relate to or to learn from or to relate to is maybe kind of putting another box, which is what she's talking about breaking out of. Next up, I read a book that's had a lot of buzz lately. This was on hold for me forever at the library because there was so much demand for it. This is Ducks, 2 Years in the Oil Sands by Kate Beaton. She's the author of Hark, a Vagrant, which was a ongoing comic series for a long time. She, just out of university, I'm going to talk about student debt again, decided that to pay off her loans, she was going to go work in the oil sands. And she was from Nova Scotia, Cape Breton. A lot of people from the East Coast went up to northern Alberta to work in the oil sands. Still do. This is a really common thing that you hear about in Canada. And so there's a lot of stealth commentary about regional issues and the environmental issues and the financial driver of you want to go back and you want to maintain this culture and that's something that I think you see in the background. There are parts of the rural Nova Scotia where they're speaking dialects of Gaelic that don't exist in Scotland anymore and things like that. And you hear a lot of the dialect of rural Nova Scotia and of Newfoundland in here as well. So I think there's a lot about this that is very Canadian, that's very clearly, if you know people from the East Coast, you will recognize the accents that she's writing about. If you have worked in the oil and gas industry, you will recognize, you know, she's working at Syncrude and she's working at the various sites, and you know, okay, that's when she's in Fort McMurray, and that's when she's living at a camp, and what's the culture of that going to be like? And I thought that was great. The name comes from an incident that then a lot of the sites ended up trying to prevent ducks from ending up in the lakes, which is a really common thing. I remember when that happened. That was in the late 2000s. This was in a time, I wasn't in northern Alberta, I was in southern Alberta at the time. And my now ex-husband was in audit at one of the oil companies. And so this was something you'd hear about, like social, just in life, people talking about these ducks and the bad publicity and all of that. So I was charmed by all of these elements of this and how it kind of makes her grow up and figure out now she'll now that she's paid off her loans, she can go and do this cartooning career. Some of the negative critiques that I read about this when I was looking at the lower reviews on Goodreads, I think were for people who don't necessarily pick up on all of the cultural elements that were at play. I saw a couple of people saying, well, why does she not think about the environmental costs prior to this very end point? And I think that's kind of ignoring what the whole mythology of people in these depressed regions in Nova Scotia and Newfoundland who have no options at home have this myth of you work in northern Alberta for a few years and then you can go back and buy a house. You work in northern Alberta for a few years and then and that is in here, but maybe it's not explicit enough for some people who are just completely unfamiliar with how that goes culturally. This book is really heavy. Similarly, I thought there were maybe a couple of points, especially when she's talking about sexual harassment on the job sites and date rape and that kind of thing happening, where, again, I wondered if maybe there could have been a bit more cultural context for people who aren't necessarily familiar with that kind of not only very male culture in the sense that there might be 10 men to one woman, but also the isolation, and especially this is 15 years ago, so it was more isolated than it would be now with, you know, everything being online and services being better. But imagine even 10 years before that, and keep in mind she, at 21, 22, 23, was working with people in their 50s as well, who would have been doing this in the 90s and early. And so I don't know if that cultural piece was in there enough, but I thought that was just a really good portrayal of this very specific kind of cultural thing, as well as the moment in time, of that very specific kind of cultural movement and migration pattern for work and all of that. So yeah, top notch. And finally, I read a novel, and that was The World and All It Holds by Aleksandar Hemon, who wrote, if you haven't, where do I have it? Who wrote a memoir several years ago, which you have to flip over because you read halfway. Part of it is about his parents, and then you read to the midpoint, and then you flip over the book and read it from the other direction. It's about his own life, which is fantastic. And this is a novel that's centrally about one man who is being carried along by the tides of history, and he's not necessarily super active except in the sense that he is trying to stay alive. At various points he's trying to stay alive because his friend, later his lover, is keeping him alive, or on the flip side, he's trying to keep him alive, so he's keeping himself alive to do that. And later on, he's traveling with his daughter, who's biologically the lover's daughter, but becomes his daughter, and he's trying to keep her alive. And he's just buffeted by history. So he's in Sarajevo in 1914. He's fighting in the First World War. He ends up in a prisoner of war camp in Uzbekistan when it was the Russian Empire, and they're there while the Russian Empire is becoming the Soviet Union and that chaos. They're then in Shanghai in the 30s under the Japanese occupation. The number of global horrors of the early 20th century that he is marching through it's one of these things, the chapter list tells you what year and what city they're in, and you look at the years and the cities and go, oh my God, this is going to be awful. And it's awful, but it's brilliant because it doesn't focus on any one thing. The story doesn't carry us from one place to another. There are jumps in time, and a lot of the time, because the main character is at one point addicted to morphine, later he's smoking opium, and so he's never quite 100% in reality. And once his lover disappears, he starts hallucinating him, and so he's having conversations, and initially you think this is happening in his head, but later we see from other characters that he's having these conversations out loud with someone who's not there. And it's just this fascinating portrait of a person. It's also, by genre, histographic metafiction, because we have a researcher who sometimes pops in and says, well, we know this happened because that happened. We know this happened because that happened. And so the book is kind of you're rolling with the emotions of the main character more than you're rolling with the reality. And so you bring in a lot of the external knowledge that you have of history because you know more or less what's happening. And some of the descriptions are still graphic, so it's grounding you to things. Like there's one point where the main character is amputating the toes of a British spy who has gangrene, and it's graphic. There's another point where he has a different lover, not the main one who he hallucinates, but who is beaten to death, and in a particularly graphic way. But because you are in the mind of someone who is not in his right mind exactly, there's something almost weirdly ethereal to really horrific actions. Like, it's really great stuff. It's almost funny because as the daughter gets older and as time goes forward, there's almost a temptation to flip to the back to see what the cities and years are, because you are thinking like this main character is Sephardic, he's Jewish, so you think, oh God, don't be back in Sarajevo in the 40s. And then you get further and like, okay, good, but don't go back in the 90s either. So even when horrific things are happening, you think, oh, well, at least it's not the horrific thing that I thought was going to happen. It's some other horrific thing. Just really great stuff. Now, this is maybe slightly spoilerish, although I don't think so, because this is going to be about style rather than content. The final chapter of this, or the epilogue of this, is about the researcher character that we sometimes get the little asides from. And I don't love that. I like it when the outside person stays outside. But what I thought was exceptionally clever here, but that I think will only come through for people who have read about the author more, is that part is meant to make you think, here's an autofiction element. Because the researcher / writer has a bit where he's talking about himself, and he says that he's a Bosnian writer who was at a conference in Chicago in 1992, and he happened to be there when the war started, so he ended up staying and being able to claim refugee status without having to go back home. And that is true for the author and the in-story researcher. However, the inspiration for the story that we see the writer in the book have is not the inspiration from the story that this actual writer had. So rather than a character from the book showing up and talking to him, the reality is that he read a book that we see mentioned in the middle, The British Spies, is based on an actual British spy. And so it's hilarious because Hemon talks all the time that he writes anti-autobiographical work. So even when he's writing a memoir, it's not exactly a memoir, or he's acknowledging the lie. So if he's writing what looks like autofiction, you know more of that is not true, is invented. Because even when he writes an autobiography, some of it's going to be invented, and he's acknowledging that. So I thought that was really clever, knowing the backstory. But if I didn't know the backstory, that would have annoyed me, because it's definitely the kind of thing that I don't like to see in this genre. I would prefer the mystery researcher to stay outside, sort of like in Timothy Finley's The Wars, where there's an outside researcher who's talking about the characters, but we never meet them. And that is always what I would prefer, because it's so obviously trying to make you think that it's autofiction when it's not. I thought that was kind of delightful. So yeah, this is fantastic, but also depressing and quite graphic in bits. So, but also depressing just in the sense that the history of the early 20th century was depressing. So that was fantastic. I saw Audrey from Perpetual Pages mentioned reading the advanced copy of this, and I went, oh, I didn't know that was out yet, and picked it up the same night. Now, they described this in very different terms than I did, but also loved it. So I will link to that review video too, because depending on your taste in these kind of things, that may be a better review for you to watch than mine was, just as a data point. In any case, if you have read any of these, I would love to hear what you thought. Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.